Welcome to a new episode of the Creative Industry Insight podcast. I'm your host, Bobby. Today, we welcome sound designer Paul Germann, who joins us to talk about his work on the Iron Claw. Paul will talk us through how he created the sound design for the sport of wrestling and how important it was for him to make the matches feel as authentic as possible. Please be warned that there are heavy spoilers in this episode. Now let's jump into the conversation with Paul. Hi, Paul. Thank you for joining me today.
I'm pleased to be here.
I'm excited to sit down and talk about the Iron Claw, which came out recently in the UK. I know it came out last year in North America, which is like a bit of a weird sort of scheduling, knowing that you've got a film that comes out 2 months before in another area, and you have to wait so long just to see it. And I know it's based on real life, so there are spoilers out there that you can find, but then it's also you don't want the magic of the film to be spoiled as well.
Yeah, no, it certainly is a movie that, the twists and turns in the plot, if you don't know the story, really do take people by surprise. And I think that's one of the reasons it's connected with audiences is that the true story is so extraordinary. And for the most part, the movie's quite accurate. I mean, they did take some creative licenses, which we can talk about later if you like, but for the most part, they really did stick to real life, and that was something that was one of our key kind of directives in sound, was to try to be authentic, try to be real, try not to embellish things too much.
I guess with like films that, because at the beginning it does say, based on a true story, but it doesn't necessarily say this is a completely 100% true story. And I think it's one of those films as well because there's so much tragedy in it and so much sort of heartbreak that I think you just don't want it to become like a misery porn and that there's too much sadness in it. But then there's also the balance of it and all that. Like as a writer and director is probably very difficult, especially when you want to be as true as possible to the story.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, I should ask first, can we spoil things in the plot here on your broadcast?
Yes, yes, yes,
Okay.
yes.
So
I'll put a
hopefully people
spoiler
see.
warning before.
So, in the film, there's these five brothers who are part of this wrestling dynasty. Well, I guess it's four brothers. One brother died when he was very young, but in reality, there were six brothers, and the sixth one also died tragically by suicide, like two of the other brothers in the film. But the director Sean Durkin decided to, for the most part, eliminate his story. They incorporated some of his biography into one of the other brothers' characters, Michael. But Sean just felt it was just too much, tragedy porn, if you want to call it that, or it was just too much for the audience to take yet another horrifying, death, given that there was already so much tragedy in the family. So it's been interesting to me because I've seen some people complaining that, oh, it's not accurate and they left out this extra brother. But yeah, I mean, I would say the movie's devastating enough as it is.
Yeah, and there's always there's a few scenes that I want to talk about later on, which I think adds with the sound design really does make the scene. But then also there's certain when I watched it with the audience last night, there was audible gasps, sorry, when it happened. So you're kind of like, yeah, you are put through the ringer a little bit. But let's go to the beginning. How did the project come about, and what made you want to take it on?
I had worked with Sean on his previous feature film, The Nest. In fact, the whole sound crew, it was the same sound crew, which was great. Sean wanted to use the same people. So that was our mixing team, our head mixer, Matt Chan. And actually on The Nest, Matt did everything. He was the sole mixer on a feature film, which is really unusual, but it had a limited budget. On this film, we did bring in a second mixer, our sound effects and Foley mixer, Graham Rogers. But on that earlier film, The Nest, I did the sound design, sound effects. with Brendan Mercer, who also worked with me on Iron Claw. And the dialogue was headed up by Martin Gwynne Jones, one of your countrymen, who also worked with us on this. So yeah, it was the same team. We had the same. Sean used the same picture editor, Matthew Hannum. So yeah, we had a great time on The Nest. It's a really well done film, much like The Iron Claw. It's filled with amazing performances and a really keen eye to the subtleties of human behavior and human psychology. And yeah, it's fairly rare that I get to work on a film of this quality. And so I jumped at the chance when Matt Chan, our head mixer, reached out and said, "Hey, Sean's got another film. Are you available?" So without knowing anything about it, I said yes.
I think it's always nice when you get to collaborate with people again, and especially when you've had a good time working with them. I think that's why then you kind of, as you said, you would take a job on without sort of knowing what it's about, what it is about, and that probably helps with knowing that you're gonna have a good time. You've got good people that you're working with, and you just sort of that you'll be looked after as well, and you know that it's going to be something. It could be something really good without reading a script. But once you sort of found out it was wrestling, were you a fan of wrestling when you were growing up? And did you know about the story prior to it all?
Yeah, it's interesting. I watched wrestling as a teenager in the 80s. It was back then it was called WWF. Now it's called WWE, the main wrestling promotion. And I think like a lot of people, I was more aware of the villains than the heroes. And in wrestling terminology, I ended up learning a lot of wrestling terminology for this project. But the villains are called the heels, and the heroes are called the faces. But the heels are a lot more colorful, a lot more interesting. So growing up, I was aware of Ric Flair, who's portrayed in the film, and yeah, various other kind of bad guys, Andre the Giant or whatever. So I'm pretty sure I would have seen the Von Erich brothers, at least some of them, in matches, but just didn't take notice of them. So no, I wasn't really into wrestling. I watched it for a while, and I was one of those people who, when I realized it was all fake, because it wasn't obvious right away, especially back then. When I realized it was all scripted, then I lost interest. And I find it fascinating that today most wrestling fans are well aware that it's scripted, or mostly scripted. It's not entirely scripted. They improvise things, and that doesn't get in the way of their enjoyment, which is actually what's the sort of, I think, the key to its success is that it is a form of theater. I think of it as this sort of cross between theater and like acrobats or something. Like I don't think of it as a sport, because it isn't really. It requires a lot of physical prowess. It's a very demanding that way, but really it's about performing a narrative, a narrative that goes across the course of the match, for the audience to engage with and to have an emotional connection to. There's a point in the film when Zac Efron's character Kevin is explaining what he does to his future wife, played by Lily James, and he says, you succeed at this job if the audience reacts to what you're doing. So if the audience is excited about you or engaged with you, and that's the key thing. So yeah. Anyway, I'm kind of digressing there, but so I wasn't really a wrestling fan the way, say, Sean Durkin. I mean, he's a big time wrestling fan, and but I always found it very intriguing, especially the artifice of it all. And so yeah, when we got into this, I did a lot of research, just so I could understand what it was about. I came across a really interesting essay by Roland Barthes, who's a cultural theorist. And it turned out I brought it up to Sean in the mix on the mix stage, and he's like, "Oh yeah, that was a key reference point for us, was his essay about wrestling." And he'd written this, I think it was the early 70s, and he looked at it in terms of being theater. And Barth himself, I know he's this intellectual, I think French intellectual, but he was a big wrestling fan as well. And he sort of delved into this idea that what drives wrestling, professional wrestling, this thing we're talking about, is the concept of justice and injustice. And that's the main appeal for the fans, is they're coming there to watch justice be done, or sometimes justice isn't done, and that gets people really worked up, and they create these arcs over a series of matches, say between a heel and a face, where the heel keeps winning, and often they're winning by deceptive means. They're getting help from their manager, hits some guy over the head with a chair or whatever it might be, and that gets the audience riled up because that's unfair. And it's funny because when we were scripting what's called loop group, like when we get a group of actors to come into the recording booth to do voices for the crowd, and we were looking up things for them to say. And so I did a bunch of research, listening to wrestling matches and that sort of thing. And some of the more interesting phrases that would come up were about this, what would seem to be connected to this idea of justice. So, people yelling things like "make him pay," that sort of thing, and it's like, they want that catharsis of seeing this dastardly villain get their comeuppance, and that's the whole appeal of it. I don't remember your original question, Robert.
It's okay. I think you answered it because it was about if you were ever a fan of wrestling, and
Right.
I think because I was a fan of wrestling until I found out it was scripted, and I don't know. I guess you lose the interest a little bit because you think, oh, it's not. It doesn't feel as brutal as if you were watching it, and I think I only found out because it was like a documentary that I saw on TV. Many like this was really, really young, and they were saying, yeah, all of it's fake. The crowd, they get given signs, they get given this, that, the other, and I was just like, oh, my whole life has been a lie. How can I? It's like when you find out Santa's not real. Um,
Yeah, but it's interesting because fans by and large do know it's fake, and I think in a way it functions in a different way, but it almost works better because they get to be part of this theater, and in a way the audience members are performing themselves in a sense, and they're able to unleash their passion and their anger and all of that as they're at ringside, and it's like I said, it's cathartic for them. I don't get that catharsis myself watching it, but I do find it fascinating that others do. And just as an aside, Rick Rubin, the record producer, he's a big wrestling fan, and he talks about it being the great American art form because it embraces artificiality, and it embraces we watch movies and they're entirely fake, but for us to enjoy them, for the most part, you kind of suspend your disbelief and you put that part of your brain aside, and you're able to just fall into the film. And the better the film, the easier it is to do that. And you get excited and your heart races, and you feel danger and jeopardy at certain moments, and you feel excitement at others, and you feel triumph, and it's all fake. But I think because of that, it maybe makes it in some ways easier to, I don't know, indulge those emotions or what have you.
yeah, and as it mentioned as well, like it's another form of theatre, and having that good versus bad, people get rattled up by the heels, and it is this a simple good versus evil, but how do you ham it up for live audiences? And yeah, people go wild for it, and it's incredible to see because it's like somebody's passionate about it and really likes it, and you see them, you just see that sort of fire in their eyes from seeing it, and you can see that they just get all worked up, and it's like more power to them. But getting back to the Iron Claw itself, where do you begin when it comes to sound designing a biopic film that has sports elements, but it's also it's going to be based in a certain time period? Are there things that you look in your research in how certain material might have sounded during that time, or how certain fights might have happened during that time as well?
Yeah, for sure. Obviously the most important part of the film sound wise were the wrestling matches. We had to be very conscious of keeping sounds appropriate for the period for other scenes. So, say the cars, we're using recordings of older cars and phone rings or whatever it might be. We're just conscious of what year that a given scene takes place in, so we can make those adjustments. But the main challenge was the wrestling scenes themselves. Fortunately, we had a former professional wrestler as a resource, a guy named Chavo Guerrero Jr., and he was the official wrestling consultant on the film. And he plays the role of the Sheik in the film as well. He's in one of the earlier matches. So one of the very first things I did was gave him a call, and we talked at length about mostly about the ring itself, what it was constructed out of, because we wanted to make sure we had the right sound for that. And it was interesting because he said, the rings are all kind of built out of the same materials, but there is no standardization with how they're built. So, they have a steel tube frame, then they're topped with wooden planks, and then there's some kind of vinyl covering over that. And then the ropes are wrapped with tape, and then there's these turnbuckles in the corners. And so, yeah, he kind of emphasized that there's no one specific right way that these rings sound, and which was great because it gave us some latitude to make sure that we were using sounds that reflected those materials, but we didn't have to worry about it being a specific thing. We also had a great resource from the production itself, which was that our sound location recordist had put microphones all around the ring while they were shooting. And most of that wasn't usable for us because there were crowds cheering and dialogue, and so you couldn't find clean sound. But there's one scene in particular in the film, later in the film, where Zac Efron's character is just practicing by himself in the ring, and he's bouncing off the ropes and he's doing body fall after body fall on the ring. So we had amazing recordings from that of what that ring actually sounded like. So that was sort of formed the spine of what we were doing. And then as we do in sound design, we enhance that with similar elements to make things sound richer and heavier, more impactful. And and another thing Chavo told me was that, sometimes in a given arena, they'll actually put microphones under the ring and amplify that sound through speakers in the arena. So you have this exaggerated sound when somebody does a body fall, or this there's a technique professional wrestlers use called a bump. So let's say they're going to hit somebody with their hand, and pretty much at the same time they're hitting their foot down on the mat to create a big sound that's meant to make you think that was the sound of the hand hitting the guy. And so, yeah, between the body falls and the bumps, we had this great core sound, which then we enhanced. And yeah, at one point we actually, I looked around at renting out an actual professional wrestling ring and recording there. But we discovered that once we got into the production sounds, and we saw that we'd had this stuff from set, and then we went through our own libraries to see what we could use, and then we did a bunch of recording with those materials as well, and layering all those sounds together gave us what we needed for the ring. And so that was one big half of it. The other big half of it, and actually the biggest challenge of all in the film, were the crowd sounds. And crowds are always tricky because it's so many different elements, like so many different voices. And when you layer them all up together, you run into the challenge of them kind of canceling each other out or washing each other out. You lose detail and clarity and impact. But if you don't have lots of voices, then it doesn't have the weight or size that you feel like it should have. So yeah, initially, like, we did all this crowd work, and we sat down in the mix theater to put it the first big wrestling scene together so that we could share that with our director Sean and see if we were on the right track. And we put it all up and we listened through, and we were like, wow, that was overwhelming. That was amazing. That was so impactful. But then we watched it again and thought, yeah, but it's all kind of the same thing. It's just this wall of voices without enough dynamics. So that started us on a journey of figuring out how to get that size and impact of the crowd while still having a lot of dynamics. And what we ended up landing on was really focusing on more individual voices and what, say, the first, 10 rows would have sounded like, because it's almost more than enough at that point. And it just took many, many passes on those crowd tracks, both in editing and in the mix theater, and shaping and reshaping and adding elements and taking others out, almost like carving a sculpture or something. You're taking little pieces out as you go, and it all paid off. I think those crowd scenes sound to me really exciting, and they're pretty accurate sounding too if you compare them to how those wrestling matches sounded back in the day, which you can find a lot of them on YouTube, including matches featuring the Von Erich brothers. So that was a great reference. We could listen to them and follow that.
So just to sort of go back to the beginning of your answer, because you're talking about, well, maybe more of the middle, when you're talking about the rings and how they sounded, and how somebody on the production sound team had captured the sound of that as well. Isn't it? Did you find it amazing how when you're talking about the how each ring would sound, that they didn't all sound the same, necessarily the same, even though they had been all constructed in a certain way, there's still like certain aesthetics to them that don't necessarily wouldn't it wouldn't be like a one sound fits all sort of thing.
It just freed us up from thinking it needs to sound exactly like this, because as I mentioned earlier, one of Sean's kind of main focuses was authenticity, and he really wanted to make sure that people who were big wrestling fans who were going to see this movie wouldn't watch and go, oh, this doesn't sound like what I'm used to. But when we found out that Chavo's expression, I think, was like, it's a wild west out there in terms of how people build these things, but they all basically have the same materials, and they're built so that there's some bounce in the planks, so that when wrestlers fall, they don't get necessarily injured. And they're also built to make the sound so that when they hit, as a distinctive kind of hollow, rattly sound that just conveys violence to the audience. So yeah, that's I don't know if that answers your question, but
Yes, well, it does in a way, because it's, I guess, as a job of a sound designer, that you want to think, you do want to be restrained with all of it being sounding the same, so that each fight, every way that the cast were hitting the ropes or hitting the floor, would be that same sort of thumping echo of like hitting it. And I also think then, as when you're in a cinema or at home listening to it and watching those fights, you can then distinguish what the difference is with them. But then also, it could also come down to the higher somebody might go up to the different levels of wrestling. If they go to, if I know we don't see it, but if they went to Japan, for example, where wrestling was huge, then I can imagine that the quality of the ring would be a lot better than, say, something else in someone's back garden, you know?
yeah, probably the way the Japanese focus on excellence. Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, we didn't have any scenes outside the States, so that made that part of it easier. It's funny though, when you watch these matches on YouTube, I would say with at least half of them, the only thing you hear is the crowd screaming and the announcer's voiceover. You can barely hear any of the thumping or body falls on TV, or the wrestlers yelling at each other. I think as the years went on, so that started to change. Maybe they mic'd it differently, as the 80s kind of evolved. Because yeah, as you watch later fights, you can more clearly hear what the wrestlers are saying to each other, and you can hear the hits and all that. But it was, of course, we took that license there and said, "Well, we want to hear this stuff," especially because for the most part, the camera's in the ring with the wrestler, so you need to present that point of view. But I wanted to mention something about the crowds again, because like I said, that was the more difficult thing to do. And I found this great resource online, which was for us, which was it was an episode of 60 Minutes, which American news show from the early 80s, focused on wrestling fans. And kind of the angle of it was like, why are these people so passionate about something they know is fake? And that got into this whole thing about they're going there to feel this catharsis, and some of the fans who were interviewed said things along the lines of like, my life is hard, my job isn't easy, and sometimes it feels unfair, and so I come here and I can get those feelings out, and have that release. And so that was a really interesting psychological insight. And the other thing that we discovered from that was and especially with the Von Erichs themselves, that they were really popular with women fans because they're these big, muscly, handsome guys. And so when we were watching YouTube matches with the Von Erichs, you really noticed in a lot of them that the predominant sound in the crowd were women screaming like louder than the men, in this almost semi, hysterical way, as though they were like the Beatles or something. It had that energy to it, that kind of like out of control passion sort of thing. And so that informed how we approached the crowds too. We started to adding in more women screaming, and I just combed all of our libraries, because we've done a million horror films and things like that, so there's no shortage of women screaming. But we just to find the ones that had the right tone to them, that they didn't sound like death screams exactly, but they were that kind of unbridled, uh, you know, I don't care who's watching me kind of a scream, and so that if you watch the film, we've got those woven in, and they help bring that energy that I think was typical for those Von Erich brothers matches.
I wanted to get onto the crowd soft because when you first started talking about it and how like the way that you would do the sound, because I was just picturing in my head that it would be a everything on the timeline is quite flat, so that when you listen to it, you could hear various things, but it's more the sound of it. And then as you said the first time, you said it was so powerful, but then the second time you start tweaking about where the sound is coming from. And I can imagine it was being quite fun as well, knowing that okay, from the left speaker let's get this like, yeah, finish him. And then in the right speaker, we can put something else like, suplex him, or then coming from this side, we can have something where you can hear when they hit the mat, somebody could be like, ooh, and those sort of sounds coming from it as well.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Shaping the crowd reactions to what's happening in the ring was really key, and we just kept pushing further in that direction because these matches are scripted pretty tightly. I was my understanding, and so what you have is from one moment, the good guy's winning, and then something happens, and then the bad guy's winning, and then there's another twist, and then the good guy's winning, and so on and so forth. So there are all these ups and downs, and because we were telling the story from the point of view of the Von Erichs, Sean made this decision that for the most part, there's a few exceptions, but for the most part, the crowds are on their side, and so that gave us a pretty clear direction. During the match suddenly Von Erich was on the ropes, as they say, then we the crowd's upset and they're booing and this sort of thing. And then when Kevin suddenly climbs up to the top ropes and flies through the air and takes out a heel, then the crowd is ecstatic, that sort of thing. So building those dynamics, that kind of roller coaster of emotions, was really key to making the scenes work, and finding these peaks and valleys, and then of course how high should this particular peak be, how low should that particular valley be, so that you get this exciting arc throughout the match.
As much as people are watching what's happening on screen, it's the sound that's going to immerse you into actually believing what's happening is real. Like you want to, as Sean wanted to make it as authentic as possible and really bring the crowd in, not crowd, sorry, the audience in to what's happening on screen. And I think you have perfected it in a way that is just like, you're just like, yeah, this is really going on. And you also feel the adrenaline from the crowd building up, so you can take that in to what's happening on screen. And there's even the song by Rush, with Tom Sawyer when they're walking in. It's just like the crowd building up to that, and you just you're kind of like, yeah, let's kick some ass.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. It's one of the best ones in the whole film. And in real life, I think it was Kerry Von Erich was known as the modern day warrior, was his nickname for a while there, and that line comes from the lyrics from that song. So he that was his entrance song for a while, Tom Sawyer, and so they used that in the film, and created this very exciting montage, the three brothers fighting three opponents and all that. And of course, I'm Canadian, of course, and Rush is from Toronto, so there's an extra layer of attachment for me because I grew up listening to that album, and So it's a great needle drop moment in the film. And I love that it's literally a needle drop. Like you see the brother dropping a needle on the vinyl and boom, we're off to the races.
It's so sort of like simple as well, even though it is sort of needle drop that it's so the proverbial and visual, but it's also just that song as well. It kind of just like, yeah, okay, I'm feeling it. And then you got that bass line like dun dun dun, and you're like, okay, we're building up to something. And then they obviously have the fights as well. But what I'm curious about as well, because there are moments in the film where it is quite still and quiet, where it becomes quite dialogue heavy and performance. This is where certain performances shine, and you really feel a certain presence from actors. I think there's one scene that made my audience gasp, and that was when you find out Kerry's had his leg amputated, and not leg, sorry, foot, sorry, and amputated, and people people were like, oh my gosh. When it comes to a scene like that where there isn't any dialogue, but a lot of it's down to the character's performance, but there are hints of sound that need to be sprinkled into it. How do you go about creating scenes like that where you don't want the sound to overtake the performance?
Yeah, that was a challenge. I mean, it always is, because in most films, the soundtrack is more active and just busier than it would really be in real life. Like we're always looking for how can I justify adding another sound because you're trying to make the environment sound rich and interesting. And so, I mean, there's cliches about sound effects that every door has a squeak or a creak, that sort of thing, or every car tire squeals or whatever it is. But we do that, we push that as far as we can just to make the show more engaging and exciting. And we have to put reality aside a little bit in that case. But Sean is really, like I said, really interested in authenticity, and he he would resist often additional sounds that we had put in there if they just didn't feel like they were real to him. And so you had to find a balance because if you made it sound exactly the way it would, it might just be a bit too dull of a track. So you just find that sweet spot of where you can put in just a little bit of stuff, and a lot of it's subtle. So I would think for the most part, audiences don't even notice it. But the scene you're talking about, we don't know that he's lost his foot yet. We see him waking up in bed after this, what seems like something happened on a motorcycle, and again, we don't really know. And he gets up and he grabs his crutches and he starts walking away. So, just a simple decision we made there. Let's make the crutches rattly in a way that suggests he's not used to using them. He's not good at using them. And then we have a little bit of morning birds chirping outside that I think we'd used the same types of birds earlier in the film. So it was like, yeah, it's just another day on the farm, but something's a bit off. He's got these crutches. What's that all about? They're rattling. He's uncomfortable with them. And then it cuts to him in the bathroom crushing up some pills. And just a very subtle thing, but we had a bathroom fan sound in there. It was a bit of a junky sounding bathroom fan and has a bit of a whine in it. And it's just a little uncomfortable. But you wouldn't really notice it unless I pointed it out. And then the next shot is him in the kitchen as he crutches his way into the kitchen. That's where it's revealed that his foot is missing in the wide shot. And again, there's some very subtle bird stuff you can hear, and we put in some singular birds here and there that were all appropriate for the Texas location. But in there's a bit like the bathroom fan. There's a fridge compressor sound kind of rattling away, and it's got a bit of a buzz to it. It sounds a little bit broken, and it's just a little bit of an unnerving sound again. So we would do those kind of subtle things throughout, especially all the non-wrestling scenes. And often it was about less is more, like pulling things out and having more breathing room, but just leaving enough of that material in the background sounds that would just keep the energy going in a scene. And yeah, and like I said, it was especially challenging because Sean has such a high bar of what he's shooting for in terms of making it accurate, nuanced, all that sort of thing.
You know, when you're adding in sounds and not taking away from the scene, do you ever find that maybe sometimes the edit might affect the way that you make sound design? So if a scene is flowing in a certain way, or there's certain act, I know there'll be certain actions an actor would do that you'd have to be like, oh, okay, they've walked in a certain way with the crutch, so let's make that sound um, unsteady so that he's not used to using that. But then also on top of that, you're talking about using a fan that if you don't know is pointed out, if you, unless you point it out, you wouldn't realize it's necessarily going on. How do you add those sort of invisible sounds into scenes?
So I don't quite understand your question.
So I guess it became a bit of a twofer there. So sorry about that. So I guess the first I'll go with the second one. But I guess the second part that I was going to ask, that was kind of getting hinted at is when you're talking about when they're in the bathroom and the fan is going off, and unless you said, oh, if you listen out, you could hear the junkie fan going off and you can hear it rattling. When it comes to those scenes and placing sounds like that in, it's kind of invisible work, if that makes sense. So as an audience member, you're transported into that room, but you feel like it's a normal sound rather than something that's over overworked, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, sounds interesting because it is invisible, like literally invisible, but it's also invisible often to people's awareness, versus visual things where they're, people, it's much more easy to be conscious of what you're looking at. But with sound, it can really hit your subconscious more, or at least your, yeah, like I'll call it that. But so in some ways you have more latitude to put sounds in. If you do it artfully, you're picking the right kind of sound. And it's, there's a lot of things we do to we take we pick certain sounds or record them, whatever, and then we add reverbs and do EQ and this sort of thing so they feel like they really are in the space. And if you do all of that artfully, then it can be very invisible, and you don't even know it's there. I mean, even filmmakers, often not unaware of a lot of what's in the track. You'll I'll be in a mix situation with a director, and I might ask a question like, oh well, what did you think of that cicada I put in there? And they're like, is there a cicada in there? And often if it's again done really well, you don't notice it. It kind of marries itself to the image, and it just feels like that's the image. Like it's not, and that's in some ways the sign of good sound work is that you don't notice it. I think there's exceptions to that. There are times when it's great to have sound you notice and that's in your face and all that. But yeah, we do have a lot of leeway, and just with experience, you learn which kinds of sounds are more forgiving that way and which ones aren't. There's some sounds when you put them in, if it's something that you can't see on screen, like it's something in the environment, some sounds that might make you go, oh, wait, what is that? And what's the story there? What's going on? Let's say a dog bark, for example, if it's a certain type of dog bark, it's agitated, or I don't know, something unusual about it, it can be distracting. And you're like, well, what is that? But if it's just the right kind of lazy dog bark and it sounds kind of far away, then suddenly it becomes kind of like the wallpaper in the room. Like you don't really notice it. It's just in the same way that you might be in your house and you'd hear a dog barking down the street. You might not take notice of it, or even a faraway siren or whatever it is. It's just like, oh, I'm in the city. So, so yeah, like that's what we do. We try to make these environments as immersive as possible and have all these subtle sound cues to constantly tell the audience, yeah, this is a real world you're in. You keep believing, keep suspending your disbelief, and follow the journey of the story.
It's that the subtleness and that invisible work that the crew do always sort of make the film. And it's funny because if it's invisible, people won't notice it. But then if something's slightly off with it, it could take them out of the film and ruin their experience. So it's quite an interesting fine line for people to walk in terms of, hey, we're here, but then also we're not here.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and
Um,
I mean, for better or for worse, because on the one hand, it gives sound people more latitude to do things because it's often people aren't conscious of what we do. They'll just go, "Oh wow, that was great." They don't always know why. They just enjoy the experience of watching it. And the downside of that from being in sound is that sometimes the value of what we do isn't recognized, and people don't, filmmakers or producers or whoever, don't always understand what we're adding to the production value. I mean, it even goes down to, it's rare for a sound designer to get a head credit on a film. But if you look at what we do and what we contribute, especially for certain types of films, like in this case, it's a sports film, so sound played a big role in the wrestling scenes. But a more obvious example would be a science fiction film, a fantasy film, a horror film, and often art films. They all rely heavily on sound as one of the main, tools to tell the story. But you rarely see a sound designer's name in a head credit. But you see all these other names of, casting director and this and that, people whose roles may or may not be as significant as what we do in terms of helping the movie be what it is. So yeah, this I do like to think of sound as being invisible for better and for worse as a result of that. I will say though that people seem to be more and more conscious of sound now than say 20 or 30 years ago. I think in general people are more savvy about how films are made, and they're more interested. And the work that you're doing with your podcast is helping educate people and engage people with the craft of what we do. So fortunately that's changing, and that's great. I hope it keeps going in that direction, because the other side of that is that I think sound is really underused by filmmakers, by storytellers. It has the potential to do so much more than it usually does, because it's often an afterthought. It people should be thinking about sound and how to use it to tell a story when they're writing the script. You make a decision to say set a scene in somebody's home in a suburb somewhere, and that's the most boring sound environment you can possibly imagine. Like, again, like some distant dogs barking, a few car passes, some birds chirping, maybe a lawnmower. I mean, it's the same stuff over and over again. And it's like, well, can you just how about setting that same scene in a bowling alley? Like, I don't know what your story is going to entail, but somewhere with something where we can work with the environment. Because when we have that motivation, you can use the sound to just build up the drama of a scene, the emotion of a scene, and suddenly, you throw in the sound of the ball knocking down the bowling pins in just the right place off screen, and it helps the dialogue work better, and for a twist in the drama of the scene or whatever. So anyway, there are some sound designers in Hollywood. One of the big ones is Mark Mangini, who I know, who is really advocated for sound to be a much bigger role in film. He's been one of the pioneers of starting at the script stage, on a show, and then being there through the actual shooting of the film. Like he did the sound for Dune Part 1, and he was there for the shoot, recording props and whatnot on set. And then maybe the most important part is being engaged during the picture editing process, because when you put the sound in, especially like properly created sound by a sound designer, when you put sound into the picture edit, it changes the way they edit the picture. And generally speaking, they give a bit more room time wise so that the sound can play out, and often can see, oh, the sound is doing the thing we need this scene to do, or it's helping to do that. So yeah, it's really, I think the more people are aware of sound, what it can do, and for filmmakers really engaging with their sound team and asking them to contribute ideas along the way. I would love the opportunity to, this is very, very rare, but to read a script and say, like I said, do you think you could shoot this in a bowling alley? Or, I mean, not to be simplistic about it, but it might even just be like, well, can we have a shot of that thing? Say the screen door closing. Like they weren't planning to do a shot of the screen door closing. Can you do a shot of that? Because then we can justify that sound elsewhere in the scene or whatever it is.
It's amazing how sound does play a big part now, and I think you see people pushing stuff like sound bars, and you get to potentially have something that might be in something similar in the cinemas to what you have at home in terms of like Dolby Atmos, and people are sort of investing in it more, and they're like it's not just about the pictures, it's also just like you can get blown away by people's speakers as well. And I think it's always interesting to talk to sound designers because of that, even though a scene is crafted and shot and somebody's edited it, but as you mentioned, once you've added sound design and added in more layers, it can completely change how a scene plays out and works. I think the best way is like I think the way that sound can be used when you can relate to it is when I watched something like Nope, and you have the character in the open, out in the open, and then the use of wind makes you think you might have heard something, and how sound travels. And we've all been in those sort of situations where we've been in a field, for example, and you've heard something, or you're walking home after a night out and it's just silent, but the wind carries something, and the use of sound there just gives you that chills and gives you that sort of visceral feeling like, oh, danger potentially. You don't know. Did you hear it potentially or not? Um,
Yeah.
just go
Yeah.
with it.
Have you seen Zone of Interest?
I have not seen that yet. It is on my list to watch, but I'll see if I can try catch it before it's out of cinemas.
Yeah, I would recommend it, especially because the sound plays a really important role in that film, and in a cinema, you're really going to hear it in its best possible presentation, and that's sort of what you're describing. A lot of the sound, it's a movie about the Holocaust, and it takes place in a home that's right next to Auschwitz, and Auschwitz is mostly represented through sound, and they're just throughout the film you're kind of thinking, wait, is am I hearing what I think I'm hearing? And it might sound like at first like a bird or something else, and then you're like, no, no, that's something much more horrific than that. And that's part of the power of that film. A big part of the power of that film is how sound is used to just on the edge of your consciousness often, to suggest something, and it's really effective. One of the most interesting uses of sound in any film I've ever seen.
So the person who does that is Johnny Byrne. He's the same person that did the sound design for Nope, but I'll be interested to hear it out. But I don't know if I could put myself through it if it's like right next to Auschwitz and you can think like and you can hear that sort of sound as well.
Yeah,
Haunting.
it's interesting. I mean, in a way, it's more watchable than you'd think because of that approach. And the horror of it is almost something you more construct in your own mind, which is very unnerving. But what that does, I think, is it makes the audience feel more complicit, and feel, sort of relate more to the point of view of the Germans, who are aware of what's happening but trying to ignore it at the same time, and especially trying to ignore the moral implications of what's happening. And so yeah, it's fascinating to me how the way that sound is used kind of is just key to the thematic structure of that film. But yeah, Nope too. I mean, it's an amazing track there, and Jordan Peele is one of these filmmakers who really seems to understand sound, and Get Out as well has fantastic use of sound. That scene where they crash into the deer on their way up to the parents' house, it's so effective, and then the deer kind of with its dying groans and breaths in the woods. It's just so very well done.
Isn't it funny that the deer dying is Jordan Peele's making the voice and sound?
Is it really? I
Yeah,
didn't
I think
know.
I'm pretty certain it's that, and it's just funny to sort of think that it's just him being like they're like, oh, we can't find the right things. Like, I've got it. Get the mic out.
That's interesting because I've cut a lot of animals in my time. I did a series quite a while ago called Beastmaster about this guy who talks to the animals, kind of a Tarzan figure. And so every episode it was a new animal. So and what you discover is it's difficult to make animals sound expressive because they're not they don't have the range of vocalizations that humans do in terms of like the complexity of our language for the most part. And so you kind of have to fake that and come up with things to make animals sound exciting. And I know with deer, they kind of just make a very small handful of sounds, at least the stuff that I've heard recorded, and these kind of grunts, and they're not very expressive. So it doesn't surprise me that Jordan Peele went and ended up doing it himself so he could get more nuance and that sort of thing.
Just a funny thought. I wonder if he got credit for that or put it in his rider as well. Yeah, the sort of sound could get used. We've gone slightly over, but I just want to hit you up with my final question. Well, I've got two more, if that's okay. Sorry.
Yeah, sure.
So the first one is, what was the hardest scene to do the sound design for?
That was the hardest sort of moment is a scene where Kevin Von Erich is fighting Harley Race, and there's a moment when Harley Race does something unscripted where he lifts Kevin up and he throws him out of the ring. And Kevin, lands on the concrete, and he lands so hard that he's really struggles with getting back up again and back into the ring. And so, for the most part, if you look at the film doesn't isn't fancy sound wise. Like, we're not trying to do a lot of design work or like I guess what I mean is stylized type of work. It didn't really call for that, but that moment was different that way. We start with this regular wrestling match, and as we've been talking about, we have all of our ring sounds and the crowd freaking out and all of that. And then we have this moment where Harley Race lifts Kevin up and throws him out of the ring, and it's this very wide shot. So we we really struggled with how do we get the sound of him hitting the concrete and have it be impactful, and have the we wanted the audience to kind of wince when that happened, but the shot is so wide, it's really difficult to justify a big sound. It just feels wrong if you make it too big. So part of it was finding the right kind of slappy sound that had enough weight to it, but still felt far away. But what ended up helping us crack that one little moment was the crowd reaction. So, and we really, we move things back one frame this way and one frame that way. And eventually, and layering certain crowd gasps and shocked reactions. And when we delay the crowd after that slaps sound just enough to give it room to play, and that sold the shock of it all. And then we cut to a close-up of Kevin on the ground, and that's one of the only moments in the film where we go internally into him from a sound perspective. And so all the screaming crowd around him, it grows duller sounding. We roll off a lot of the higher frequencies and add certain reverbs. And then we wanted to follow this journey of him being like, the wind's been completely knocked out of him. He's in a lot of pain, and he slowly crawls up to the ring and then slowly pulls himself in. And it's this kind of heroic moment. And then when he's back in the ring, it's back to normal. And finding that transition from this being really internal with him and slowly bringing these crowd elements back in, like you said, with people yelling on the left and the right and cheering him on. And so that by the time he actually rolls into the ring, we made this big shift and back into the big arena sound again. It was just one of these scenes that we went over dozens and dozens of times until we had something that sort of found the right balance of things that we were looking for.
So that's probably that fight was quite brutal, and I think once you get out of the ring and you hear him slap onto the ground, yeah, that sound you really do feel it in terms of just thinking like, oh, that's not good, that's not good. But again, then when you have that internal moment, it's funny now you mention it. It's like, yeah, you're right. That's the only sort of time that you do have that internal moment of the characters and how he's sort of draining out and being like, you can't catch my breath about what's happened.
Yeah, exactly. And it's great too because it is such a rare moment in the film. It has that much more impact because you can overuse techniques like that, and then they don't mean as much.
Yeah, and I guess with like it's very easy as like a crowd to be like, oh yeah, this is probably quite easy to do in the recording booth, but it's also just like at the same time, so much work needs to go in to make sure that everything sounds correct when it hits in certain places, and also that it doesn't take the audience too much out of it, but then also you want to feel the brutality of it. Even if you're seeing it, you also want to hear it and make it reverberate in the cinema. And then just to hit for my final question, what was your favorite scene to work on?
Yeah, there were a few, but one that I enjoyed but was not a wrestling scene, but when they pull up to the sportatorium, sorry, I guess it's some fans pulling up, and you see this massive crowd outside, and there's people getting unloading coolers from a trunk and all this kind of stuff. So it's a lot of different elements, and I think there's a great song on the soundtrack at that point. It's "Don't Fear the Reaper," Blue Oyster Cult, and just had this great energy to it. And so it was a lot of little things that getting the vehicle sounds right. There's all these vintage vehicles and making sure that the engine sounded nice and throaty, and then all the different voices of people running around and creating this chaos. And I mean, I threw in like little bits of laughter here and there, and call outs and shouts and things, and just to get that excitement going. So that was really fun. I'll tell you one other one as well that's similar. Was a party that the brothers go to. They sneak out of the house because the young brother's not allowed. The parents won't allow him to go to this party. He's too young, but he and his band are performing there, so they sneak out. And so yeah, that party crowd was really fun to do because we found some really great real party recordings. You can get actors to come in and laugh and hoot and holler, but it rarely sounds like the real thing. So we had actual real recordings of a real drunken party, and so we were able to layer those into that scene. And then from inside the living room where they're doing, I think they're doing like keg stands or whatever from downing beer, and then we go outside where the brother Mike is performing, and he actually is performing live there with his band, which is unusual in films. Usually they would just lip sync to a playback for technical reasons. It's really hard to record this stuff live, but they did record it live. And so in the mix, we were able to put the right amount of processing on his vocal mic and on the other instruments, and then have the crowd reacting. So it really felt like you were there in the party, and yeah, it gave you that energy. And as I was saying earlier, it's like a lot of that's not stuff you really notice, but it just hits you on a gut level and makes you feel like you're having a similar experience to the characters in the film.
Yeah, I think that so the first scene that you mentioned, it reminded me a little bit of Goodfellas, the Copacabana scene, because it feels like there's a lot of movement about what's happening. There's excitement building. I feel like you are on a steady cam and it's going in from the parking lot into the auditorium for the fight. So you get that energy build up, and it's like that this is the sort of must thing to do on a weekend. And that's the sort of feel that you get. And Don't Fear the Reaper as well. That's another good needle drop in the film.
Yeah, well, you mentioned Goodfellas, but it's I totally know where you're coming from with that. But the other film that is maybe even a closer influence, and Sean mentioned this, is Dazed and Confused, which I think is also set in Texas, and it's in a similar time period. And so that was a touchstone for them. And the same thing, like you're saying, this kind of moving through this crowd of kids partying and all of that. It has a similar feel.
That was another film that came to mind as well, because it was that sort of summer's day of kids coming out, and you have it at dusk as well, and it just has that, and everybody pulling up in those old school cars as well, and just the whole vibe. It's just very feels fun and positive. And then the second scene as well, with the party scenes, I think you have that sort of great mix of with the music being live and performing there. I think you'd get a different sort of reaction and vibe in terms of how you're shooting that. But then also the overlaying of people having fun at the party, the cake stands, where I've never done a keg stand, but it just looks like one of the most one of the most dangerous things to do, whilst getting yourself inebriated as well.
Yeah, you'd think there would be a danger of some serious injury there. And that's probably part of the fun, right? The risk taking. That's about an interesting thing. I know we're almost done here, but Kevin himself was asked, why did this happen to your family? Why did this extraordinary thing, they had this extraordinary success to have, four different brothers were successful professional wrestlers. And then they had this horrible tragedy where four of the five brothers died before they were 30. And his and in the movie kind of suggests that the source of the tragedy might be their father who drove them too hard. There's allusions to a curse that the family is under because they took on this sort of Nazi family name. But Kevin himself said he thinks it's just that they were really reckless, and he talks about they would be driving down the highway 100 miles an hour or whatever, and one of the brothers would climb out the window onto the roof of the car. And in real life, at least a couple of the brothers, their deaths were drug related. The movie alludes to it a bit, but doesn't get too far into it. But you can see how drug use is also reckless in its way, and that fascinated me because especially back then, I think there's a lot less awareness that wrestling was fake. And these were these larger than life figures that were these heroes, almost like superheroes, really, to their fans. And so I can't help but wonder if they kind of messed with their own conception of who they were and how invincible they were, because they were playing these roles. And did that get maybe a bit confused, and they thought they could get away with this kind of reckless behavior when they really couldn't, and it caught up to them.
It's very hard to say because, as you say, there's only so many times you could tempt fate, right? Before something happens. And there's only when something really lucky happens to you, I always feel like that's your like at the top point of when luck will strike for you. So then it's like you don't want to push it anymore or try anymore. You sort of like that's when you cash in and just say, "Yep, cool, see you later, done."
Right, wise words.
But I don't always do that, so unfortunately, I do push. Paul, thank you so much for your time today. The Iron Claw is still in cinemas in the UK. It's on VOD in North America. Go out, listen to Paul's work and his team's work, and enjoy it.
Yeah, please do. And I'll put a little plug in for my website. It's paulgermann.com. That's German with two N's. And you can see the projects I've worked on there and read a bit about me. And yeah, pleasure talking to you today, Robert.
Thank you very much. I'll make sure I'll put a link to the website on the show notes as well. Thank you again. You take care and bye bye.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening. Please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast.